Part 1. Healthcare. The big argument the GOP is putting forward here tends to be something along the lines of making trans healthcare accessible encourages kids to be trans, or that teenagers are too young to make these decisions. The first argument, that access to trans healthcare encourages transgenderism, is pretty implausible. Proponents often cite the fact that the percentage of society that is transgender is rising, and that's true, but most agree that it's less because people are looking to undergo hormone therapy and wildly expensive surgery on a whim, and more because society is becoming more accepting. The second argument, that teenagers are too young to be making these decisions, isn't that plausible either. Proponents of this argument often talk about detransitioning, which is when people regret transitioning and retransition back to their original gender. Proponents argue that this happens because teenagers are allowed to transition too young, before they're sure of their decision. But there's little evidence to support this argument. Most scientific studies have found that the vast majority of trans people, about 98%, don't regret their transition, and less than 1% retransition. Furthermore, a Swedish study found that the most common reason cited for post-transition regret was a lack of support and experiences of transphobia. Basically, according to the studies that we've read and cited, the vast majority of trans people don't regret transitioning. And if they do, it's likely not because they transitioned too early, but rather because they've experienced societal transphobia. We should stress this isn't us taking a side. This is just what the studies we've found tell us. If you disagree, then link an opposing study in the comments. The argument in favour of trans healthcare laws is obvious. For people with gender dysmorphia, having to wait until you're 18 to transition can be deeply upsetting and can limit the effectiveness of some treatments. Given the fact that more than half of transgender and non-binary youths have contemplated suicide, this extra harm is legitimately dangerous. It should be noted here that trans healthcare for young people doesn't mean permanent surgery. Puberty blockers, generally one of the first forms of medical help that trans kids can receive, essentially just hit pause on puberty, and if the child stops taking them, puberty will resume as normal. Hormone therapy, meanwhile, is generally given later, and to get medical access, a trans person has to go through quite a rigmarole to prove that they need it. Put simply, kids can't just walk into a pharmacy and decide to be trans. The process is long, tedious, and filled with obstacles. Then there's the second issue, sports, and this one is more complicated. Anti-trans lawmakers often argue that higher testosterone gives trans girls an advantage, and this certainly could be true. At least, being a cis male does seem to have some advantages in certain sports, which is why so many sports are separated into men and women. On the other hand, there are massive biological advantages within the sexes as well. Some women just naturally have higher levels of testosterone, or higher VO2 max levels, and these translate to real advantages as well. The point is that sports are never perfectly fair. Some people are always going to be naturally taller or biologically better built for athleticism, so focusing on this particular form of unfairness might seem a bit arbitrary. Sport was never a strict meritocracy. Some people are just born with an advantage, regardless of gender or sex. It's also worth noting that despite near constant media attention, this actually happens very, very rarely. Only about 0.5% of people in the US are trans, and very, very few of them are competitive athletes. As such, any gains in fairness have to be weighted against the harm done to the majority of trans people who aren't competitive athletes anyway, but are forced to play casual sports with people of a different gender identity.